if we think about monopoly, again, we got to think about it in the context of the environment in which we're looking at. And we're looking at this thing of market structures, which is really how trade occurs between buyers and sellers. So it's the mechanics of buying and selling. So market structures really range from, as I say, one extreme, which we saw last week, was the purely competitive environment where we have lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers. Everybody is a price taker. The sellers are price takers. The buyers are kind of less. The market sets the price. The buyers really have no control other than say, yeah, we're not going to buy it, or not going to buy, or we are going to buy it. But effectively, price is set by the market. The opposite extreme is what we're on today, and we're looking at a monopoly where we got a one-off, and the one-off means that there is only one single provider of that product that you're buying. And it puts you at a significantly bad situation from a buyer's point of view, because you more or less only have two choices: buy it or don't. You have no negotiation. You don't have to wait for price drops or anything like that. Generally, the monopolist has so much control that you're more or less a victim of their price. So these would reflect again, a theoretical, just like purely competitive environments is a theoretical environment, monopoly is a theoretical environment, because we don't have a whole heck of a lot of pure monopolies. Most organizations fall somewhere in between, which is what we'll look at next week. But the concept of the pure monopoly is what we're looking at, and we understand the concept that makes that in-between bit more understandable. So we're going to look really at the characteristics that have dominated these monopolies. So in terms of market structure, then we're going to focus on two important output decisions: what output will the firm produce at, and what price will prevail. Okay, and in a monopoly environment, the price is really determined by the seller, and the output not so much. They have some degree of control over price. They have total control over price, but they have some degree of control over what they choose to produce. So in this unit, we'll explain what monopolies are, how they come into existence, why they must reduce their prices in order to sell more. We're going to describe how profit maximizing output and price are determined for a monopolist. We're going to explain the grounds which monopolists can be criticized, and there's lots of examples of people criticizing monopolies for their power. We're going to explain the differences between a monopoly and perfect competition, again, differentiating the two extremes. We're going to explain the grounds which a monopoly can be defended. So there are certain cases where a monopoly actually works, or in the environment, again, it depends on the environment, but a monopoly can work in some situations. And we're going to discuss ways that government can change the behavior of monopolists. Obviously, government needs to get involved. If we need a monopoly in certain environments, government needs to get involved to manage the monopoly so it doesn't put customers at an unfair disadvantage. So first thing is, what are monopolies? And if we look at it, a firm is described as a monopolist if it is the single sole producer of a product for which there are no close substitutes. And that's important, because if there are substitutes, someone can trade out and say, okay, I can find something else. And there we're running into more of a monopolistic competition environment, which we'll be looking at next week. But if you're the only game in town, and you're the sole producer, and there are no close substitutes for it, then you'll be considered a monopolist. And as I say, that is a theoretical more than a realistic. So the firm not only dominates the industry, the firm is the industry. And that's important. The firm is absolutely the industry. And there's no competition for a monopolist, which leaves a very powerful position. What we tend to find is the monopolist, if we look at this pure concept of monopolist, if there's a brand new technology, such as Web 2.0, and what I mean by Web 2.0, it is social media, okay? So if we think about the web's been in existence really for the last 40 to 50 years as we know it today. It really came into its own in the mid-1990s. So, this current generation is growing up with it as if it was part of the woodwork, but it was certainly non-existent in the traditional world up until about 1995, when general public could use the web. The web existed in industry and in academia for a while, but certainly not in the general public. So what we saw was a lot of the firms that started out with the web, or started out with the second version of the web, which is social media, which really occurred in the mid-1990s as well, or the mid-2000s, I'm sorry. What we're really looking at there is the first to market type firms, such as Facebook, which was one of the first to market, or WhatsApp became one of the first to market. Maybe it's not WhatsApp. I'm getting confused now between WhatsApp and the other one. So I should say Facebook. I'll just stick to Facebook. So there was no real competitor for Facebook when it started. There was no real competitor for IBM when it started back during the Second World War. These were one of firms who had the magic and the magic cube and the magic technology that everybody wanted at that time, and they were the sole providers of it. As time marched on, we saw more and more competitors enter the market, and it became less monopolistic and more competitive. The thing is, too, there's no competition for monopolists, which leaves them in a very powerful position, and the consumers are at a significant disadvantage in that case, and that poses some challenges for government. We're going to look at some of the things that government try to do in order to mitigate that problem. Now, the wider the market, the less chances that there's going to be a real monopoly. Like if we look at here in Clarenville, for example, you could argue that there's probably only one Walmart here in Clarenville, that type of Walmart store, right? Maybe Canadian Tire could be considered, but let's just say that there's only one Walmart. Yeah, that's true, but we can drive to St. John's and we can go to Costco, we can go to other stores that would have similar to Walmart. So the question is Walmart in Clarenville a monopoly then if we can drive to St. John's? And this is what we mean by this: as you expand your boundary of what you considered the market, the chances of a monopoly are getting slimmer and slimmer, because the fact is that you could argue that there are competitors, it's just you need to drive to get them. So the wider the market, less likely. This is why in Canada we would have more monopolistic type firms than you would have in the United States. It's just a market that's 10 times bigger in the United States would have a lot more competitors. So where do monopolies come from? Well, there's a batch of reasons that help us understand, and this is important from our perspective here, of where do monopolies come from. And the very first reason that has been identified for monopolies forming is something called barriers to entry. And a barrier to entry is a common term that we use in business that just means it's hard to get into the market, to be the first one or the second one there. There's a lot of things that you need to do, or a lot of money you have to have, or a lot of technology that you have to have in place in order to become a competitor. And if those barriers are so high, then it's almost impossible for another firm to enter the market. So, monopolies form because of difficulties experienced by other firms who attempt to enter the same market. These difficulties are called barriers to entry. Monopolies are protected from new competitors in the market because of these barriers. And we can actually break the barriers down, or we could subcategorize these barriers to entry as technical, legal, and economic reasons. So the barrier to entry could be a technical barrier to entry if we say, look, there's some sort of technology that is solely owned by this company. And that was the case in a company called International Business Machines, or IBM as we know it. IBM really had a magic potion in the war years to produce, they didn't call them computers at the day, but they were effectively computers. And they got a lot of government contracts, which enabled them to put a lot of focus on computers. And it was really, really expensive to start developing the initial computers because the technology was an unknown thing. And government fed IBM, and IBM did very well because of it. But no other firms were being fed like this. So as a result, IBM had a virtual monopoly. And the president of IBM, the first president, a guy by the name of Thomas Watson, if you watch Jeopardy, you know Watson was on Jeopardy. Well, that was named after Thomas Watson. He was the first CEO of IBM, and he was infamously quoted as saying that the world only needs a couple of computers. And anyway, he's been proven wrong, but in the context of the time, he was right. That there wasn't a big demand for computers. You know, it was only major governments that could ever buy the things. They were just so expensive and required so much technical expertise in order to operate that it really didn't work. So IBM was an example of a company that grew and dominated the market hugely because of these technical barriers. And you could argue that there's a lot of other companies too that had these technical barriers that eventually got broken down. You know, if we think about here in Newfoundland, for example, the technical barriers that in 1977, cable television came to Newfoundland, primarily in the St. John's market. But a company called Cable 9, which was owned by Danny Williams, started up in the mid-70s there and started to put a lot of time, effort, and energy into wiring up homes in the metro area to cable television. Brand new concept, never seen before. You know, I grew up in my early years with only 2 channels, and one of which was staticky, and they were over the air. And here in 1977, when we got cable TV, we were exposed to all kinds of American content coming out of Maine, usually. And it was a totally different world. Wow, you know, the picture was clear, the screen had lots of choices, there was more than 2 channels. It really revolutionized. But because of the high degree of technology that was involved in it, not every company could jump into it. The market was relatively small, and it involved running wires, so you didn't, you know, technically it was difficult for other companies to get involved. So more or less, the original cable companies were monopolies, and you either bought at the price that they offered it or didn't. Other technical barriers to entry, we could think of a company like Facebook who got in place in the more recent years. You know, Facebook really came in, and they had a technology that had never been considered before in the sense of allowing two-way communication. Originally, it was designed by a guy in a dorm room in order to get girls. And that really tricked along, and the popularity of it grew. It was really the only practical game in town, so they more or less had a monopoly. Now, to this day, even though there are many more apps out there, it still has over 1 billion subscribers. So it contains a huge amount of market control. And in fact, down in the United States and in Canada as well, there's a lot of concern that Facebook yields too much control, and government is looking at what can we do in order to manage the control of Facebook, so, and even including breaking it up into other companies. In the 1980s, in the 1980s, I got to get my decades straightened away, just the fact of getting older. We had an interesting revolution when I hit university first, an interesting revolution in the personal computer. The IBM PC just hit the market in the mid-1980s. And it allowed people some reason to own a computer. You could do word processing on it, and you could do something called spreadsheets to add a bunch of numbers up. And it involved some technical ability in order to operate it. It wasn't every Joe, it wasn't altogether user-friendly. But the IBM company developed this computer and developed the software along with another company called Microsoft, which was mainly software focused. And they really had 95% of the market was that. Another company came along in '84 called Apple that really, or they came along big in 1984. They were around before 1984. But they really kind of, even to argue that that it was no longer a monopoly after Apple came in, well, 95% of all the machines ran on this IBM technology and using Microsoft DOS as the operating system. So it was another example of a technical barrier. So there's lots of examples of technical barriers to entry that exist. We also have what's called legal barriers to entry. And these legal barriers to entry are really created by government. Government allows for a legal barrier to entry. Why? That would be the question. Why did government do this? Well, legal barriers, first of all, prevent other firms from competing in particular industry by the force of law. So in certain instances, this is designed to grant a monopoly to the production of a good and service. So let's think, for example, the Pfizer company. Let's assume Pfizer spends billions of dollars developing a vaccine for COVID-19. And they're going to go and ship that around the world and sell the product and make lots of money on it. But what if another company could simply copy it and do exactly the same thing, make a knockoff? So Pfizer invested billions of dollars. The other company invested nothing. And the other company makes all kinds of money on it because they could sell the product more cheaply, and Pfizer will be left out. So the shareholders of Pfizer say, we won't be doing that anymore. We won't be doing any more development or research because there's no incentive. Some other company can walk away with their idea and make bundles off it, and we're stuck with the bill. So what government does is they have created a legal environment called patents. And there's copyrights, trademarks too, but effectively what we're talking about here primarily is a patent. A patent is a monopoly guarantee issued by government that gives a monopoly for 20 years on a new invention that comes to market. Now, there's nothing to prevent that company, like Pfizer can contract that out or allow another company to make the product, provided they pay Pfizer a royalty. But the fact of the matter is that that company is the sole owner and the only one that is allowed to produce or allow someone else to produce that product. And it encourages investment in research and development, because if companies have this 20-year guarantee, they got a payback period to pay for your initial investment. So, patents are a good idea, but again, it does, from a consumer point of view, it does create a monopoly environment, and it does mean that medicines or important drugs or these sorts of things that are under patent can be very expensive. We also have, in certain instances, government provides a legal barrier to companies to set up just because of other reasons. It could be barriers to entry are so high that companies need to recoup their investment to it, or it could be for other economic reasons. So, for example, government in Canada has granted a monopoly for certain crown corporations to do certain things. So Canada Post, for example, was a monopoly. Provincial government liquor boards, you can't buy liquor from any private company in Newfoundland. It all gets sold through the Newfoundland Liquor Commission. Even those private stores are selling on behalf of the Newfoundland Liquor Commission. So these are what are called public franchises. So Canada Post was set up originally and grew after World War II because government needed to be able to allow mail to flow across Canada, even to the most remote parts of Canada. So in order to encourage this and to make it reasonable for one company to do it, they said, well, we'll give you a guarantee. In fact, the guarantee was a government-owned company that did this, and Canada Post is still government-owned. Other types of legal restriction are designed to give private firms protection from competition through some sort of a government license. So we talked about patents. We talked about another thing called copyright. When you make something, a piece of art or a book or something, government copyrights it, or it is automatically copyright. You don't have register. It's just your work, and your job is to protect it. And that's, again, to encourage innovation. So these legal barriers exist in Canada, and the patent is really the key one. And the idea is that it will allow for a recoup on investment and encourage research and development. We also have companies like Newfoundland Power. Newfoundland Power is government has allowed a private company called Newfoundland Power to distribute power in Newfoundland. So you could argue that that has been some form of a legal barrier to entry. They're the only ones that can sell sell power. But on the other hand, there's also an element of technical barrier in that. Newfoundland Power, for example, in order to bring the power to your house, you have to use electrical wires. And if you look outside your house, you'll see the electrical wires coming into your house. You'll imagine if there was a competing company, we got a bad enough trouble of wires going everywhere now. There will be twice as many wires. If there was two companies, twice as many wires. So we can't have that many wires strung around. So it's not practical, given the current technology, to allow more than one company to distribute power in Newfoundland and Labrador. We also have economic barriers to entry. And if we think about economic barrier to entry, it's really a function of the huge startup cost of getting into that industry. And you think about, wow, how much does it cost to build a car factory? How much does it cost to build all the distribution network? How much does it cost to build all the dealerships? It's really hard to get into the automobile industry because the automobile industry is dominated by some huge firms who have a lot of money put into building up. And it's very difficult for another firm to get in. So it's difficult, especially from an international level. That doesn't mean it hasn't been possible, though. We have a company called Tesla. Now, Tesla is owned or was started by a guy by the name of Elon Musk. Now, Elon made a fortune in the early days of the internet, coming up with internet apps and companies that made him a lot of money. Because of his deep pockets, he went and bought a former General Motors factory in California. It was owned by actually General Motors and Toyota. So they bought a factory and they designed this car. Well, there was a number of cars, but effectively these type of cars are all powered by lithium batteries. So they're a battery powered car. And they've really changed the idea of an electric car because they're sexy. And that's really what it comes down to. The technology has been around for years, but they sex them up. And amongst the gentrified group of environmentalists, they are certainly well sought after. So Elon has built this company by investing billions and billions and billions of dollars of his own money. In fact, I think right now, at this stage, or pretty close to this stage, he is a trillionaire. I think he's the world's first trillionaire. So this is what is required because the economics of starting a car company are just ridiculous, the amount of money that is required. So only people with deep pockets can do this. He's also started a space company called SpaceX. And again, deep pockets have allowed this to happen because it takes huge amounts of money in order to build a spacecraft. So these are, if we wanted to say to ourselves, what are we taking away for this, or in summary, we have a lot of things that need to be in place or need to be gelled together in order for a monopoly to come into existence. There are significant barriers to entry, and those barriers to entry can be broken down into three major types. Technical, which deal with the technology, and not everyone has the technology, or the technology is hard to come by, or the technology is rare. Strategists call this kind of thing rare. Legal, meaning that government has put in place barriers to entry in order to protect this company and let them recoup their initial research and development. Or economic, the very high cost of getting a business started means that not everybody, unless they have very deep pockets, can get into that business. So those are really very important reasons that describe why a monopoly or how a monopoly comes into existence. Now for the math side of it. So we've got, as we know, as we've seen in the perfect competitive environment, we've got these terminologies that we use: total revenue, average revenue, and marginal revenue. And we saw in the case of the purely competitive environment, the total revenue is just a function of the price times the quantity, and the price is consistent because the fact is that, the market determines the price. Well, a monopolist, unlike a competitive producer, is a price maker rather than a price taker, meaning the monopolist gets to put the price on the item. Okay? So if they're going to sell a Tesla car and they're the only one in town, they get to decide to put a sticker price of $75,000 on that car. They're the ones that get to decide that. That don't mean you have absolute power, because you still have a choice. You don't have to buy it. You can choose to buy it or you can choose not to buy it. So the thing is with this, they're able to set the price, but the fact is you decide whether or not you're willing to accept that price. Okay? So therefore, monopolists can determine either the price or the quantity it wants to sell. It could say, well, let's adjust the price so we sell enough. It can do that, but it can't do both of it, one or the other. So a monopolist does have some limitations from in order to think about, how can we maximize our total revenue? If that's the goal of a firm, they really need to set the price so that people will say, yes, I will buy it at that price. So they need to make sure that the price is not so high that nobody will buy it. Their goal, just like a purely competitive firm, is to maximize their revenue and maximize their profits. So if we look at a chart similar to what we looked at in the previous section where we looked at the purely competitive environment, same sort of thing. Let's think that we have a quantity, and let's assume, again, for the purposes of this exercise, that there are 12 different levels of output, 1, 2, 3, 4, right to 12. We'll notice that we set a price depending on our level of output. So we're the ones, as a monopolist, we're the ones determining the price. So this is a given number. So $20 for 1 and down to 9 for 12. And if you think about it, price times quantity still flows no matter what type of environment you're in. And the goal is to maximize the revenue. So assuming this scenario here, we know that these combinations of $20 times 1 unit is $20 revenue, 19 times 2 is 38, and so on. We can look at this and we can say, there is a point that maximized revenues are achieved. And if we look down through here, it's going up, goes to 110. In 10 or 11 units, it is 110 as total revenue. And then in unit 12, or 12 units at $9, our revenue starts to decline. So we're going to want to be maximizers. So we're going to either say, look, let's produce 10 or 11 units to maximize our total revenue. The average revenue is calculated the same way, and the marginal revenue is calculated the same way as in the purely competitive environment. The average revenue is just your total revenue divided by your output. So in this case, 20 divided by 1, 38 divided by 2, and so on. So this will give you your average revenue. And in terms of our marginal revenue, this is the extra revenue we get by selling one more product. So here we go with one more product. So we're going one more. Every one of these is one more. So we got 0 to 20 is 20. 20 to 38 is 18. 38 to 54 is 60. So this is what we're doing. There's the extra revenue that's coming in as we make more and more. And you're going to see here that marginal revenue at the peak is 0. And as we go past the peak, it turns to negative. So that's a telltale to monopolists to say, what type of price should I charge? We want to maximize the revenue. So for a monopolist, marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue over the change in quantity, is not equal to the average revenue. The extra marginal sales revenue that a monopolist receives for selling one more unit is not equal to the price. This is because when a monopolist sells one more unit, it gains revenue equal to the price at which it sells that unit. Notice the price drop. But it loses revenue because it's forced to drop the price, not only on the additional unit sold, but on every unit it sells. So, you got to have a single price. So effectively, this is going to start to drop down. So the marginal revenue is not the same. We still have a downward sloping demand curve, though. All this can be expressed another way. Since the monopolist and the industry are one and the same, it faces the market demand for the product, and the demand is represented by a downward sloping demand curve. So we got this standard downward sloping demand that flows. So from a consumer's point of view, this means that if the price drops, you're going to buy more. So if we look at this particular issue, this particular chart right here, we're asking ourselves, what level of output will monopolists operate? Well, price times quantity will give total revenue. So 20 times 1 is 20. 19 times 2 is 38, and so on. So we can see that our total revenue is going up throughout the progress of the quantity. Our total cost, let's assume that our total costs go up as well. And taking revenue and subtracting costs will give us our total profit. So we're going to start off where we're losing money, and this means that we just don't have a high enough level of production, really. We need to get it up. So we're going to get it up, and we bring it up to 3, and we find that that is a break-even point. In other words, total revenue equals total cost. And on the opposite extreme, too, we're going to see that there's another break-even point at 8, at 0. That's where the total revenue equals total cost. And if we keep on producing, we're going to lose, or profit is going to be negative. So our real sweet spot then is wherever the profit is highest. So as we look along, we see that profits is really highest at 2 levels, 5 and 6. What distinguishes 5 from 6, or what will we choose? Well, this is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. How much extra can you bring in? How much extra are you putting out? So profits are maximized, and output, or marginal revenue, equals our marginal cost. If we look at the chart here, we'll see marginal revenue, marginal cost, and the indicator on this is, in this particular one, that where marginal revenue and marginal cost is, that's the point of highest highest profit. Okay, so you can see that it has a profit of 18 here. We can also look at interpreting these. So these are the examples, and we can interpret them with this one here. So I just want to look at this one here just to kind of make sure that everyone's clear on how this works. Total revenue is just multiplying price times quantity. So the first one will be 2,000. 21 times 98. Oh, I don't have my calculator here. Ready? 21 times 98.
2058.
2058. So we see that our total revenue is going up. As we go along here, you're going to see total revenue is going up. Okay? Then it'll maximize, and so down here, 29 by 82. 29 times 82 will be 2,078. So we're going to see that our total revenue goes up, but at a declining rate. The total costs are given to us, so we subtract total cost from total revenue, and that will give us our total profit. Now, if you draw this out, you're going to see an area where our profit is highest. So that's going to be an indicator. Now, there might be two of these might be the same. So total revenue and total profit might be the same. So which one do we pick? Well, we need to find a place. We need to find, in order to figure out which one to pick, where marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal. So we can come down and do this one here, where we're looking at, okay, we got our quantity, we got our price, we got our total revenue, we got our total cost. What is the average cost? Well, we take our average cost, 2067, total cost, divide it by the quantity, and we can calculate that and find our average cost. So in this case, the average cost is 103.35 right here for the first one. So we can calculate our average cost by taking our total cost, dividing it by the quantity. Our marginal cost is how much our cost went up from one level to the other. Now we're increasing by 1. So we look at the marginal, we look at the average, we look at the total cost, we look at the total cost here, and it goes from 67 to 87. So our marginal cost is 20. 87 to 2112, that's 25. So effectively, the marginal cost is how much extra cost is involved by advancing along 1 unit. Marginal revenue is exactly the same thing, only looking at revenue, where we take our total revenue and we're saying, okay, how much extra revenue comes in from 20 to 21? Well, in this particular case, the marginal revenue is just the two separated. So our marginal revenue in this first instance will be 58, because the difference between what it was and what it is now is 58. And 58 to 212, that would be 42 and 12. So you can see this would be our marginal revenue. And whenever our marginal revenue and our marginal costs are equal, that's the point where, and again, profits are maximized. So you should be able to draw from this, where is the point of maximum profit? Okay, what price would give us maximum profit? And that's the big takeaway here. So we should find a profit maximizing output. So from a monopolist perspective, though, it means that in order to sell more, the monopolist still has to lower its price. So if it wants to get to that sweet spot of maximum revenue, the monopolist is going to have to think, I'm going to have to drop my price. So, you could say that the monopolist gets to decide on the price, but that doesn't mean that it's going to decide on how much money it makes. It needs to adjust the price to maximize its revenue. Again, dealing with this, a monopolist cannot sell all at once at any given price. It's forced to decrease the price in order to sell more. In order to increase its sales, monopolist is forced to reduce the price, not just on the last units, but on all of them. Total revenue is at a maximum when the marginal revenue is neither positive nor negative. In other words, 0. So a monopolist will produce only where demand is elastic. So, and again, why is that? Well, the demand has to change in order to reflect the change in revenue. So a profit maximizing output for a monopolist is where the marginal cost, how much extra it costs to make that item, equals the marginal revenue, how much extra you bring in by selling it. It's the same as what we've seen before. The extra cost equals extra revenue. And the price monopolist will charge for the output is the maximum price given the market demand curve. So again, it's going to be a revenue maximizer. That's the thing. And that is what really keeps a monopolist from going crazy in terms of price, because it can't maximize its revenue. And again, we assume a rational monopolist, and the rational monopolist will want to maximize its revenue. Okay. We also have this price discrimination. And price discrimination is how producers attempt to create at least some of the existing consumer surplus by selling a product to different people at different prices. And we've already talked about this. When you're a student, you get a student discount. You're a senior, you get a senior's discount, these types of things. So there are two major forms of price discrimination: discrimination amongst units purchased or discrimination amongst buyer groups. So the more you buy, the less per unit cost is discrimination among items purchased. And discrimination amongst buyer groups, you're a certain age or you're in a certain class or you live in a certain place. So, you think about a 2-for-1 sale, that sort of thing. Discrimination among buyer groups occurs because different groups of customers have different demands for the product. We've seen that already. So what makes a monopoly so bad? We've seen that, monopolies got to form. There's a reason sometimes they form. But what's bad from our point of view as consumers? Okay? Well, first and foremost, that we've seen based on our table where, they're going to be profit maximizers or revenue maximizers, that because they have control over the price or how many they sell, they can set it up so they're going to make economic profits indefinitely. We've seen, for example, when we talk about purely competitive markets, economic profits indefinitely were certainly not guaranteed, because as long as one company in that competitive environment is making money, it's going to attract other companies in who are going to slice the pie even thinner. So eventually, nobody makes any money. That's the theory of a purely competitive environment. As long as someone's making a buck, someone's going to come into the market and take their share. The thing is, though, in a monopoly is no one else can come into the market. So you're laughing. You're the only game in town. Instead of all three of us being lined up on the wharf down in Long Beach selling our cod, you're the only one there selling cod. And if you're the only one, they got to buy from you. So you can make an economic profit indefinitely because you can set for whatever price you want. We also talked about this idea of efficiency, and we talked about productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. Just to kind of reiterate, productive efficiency deals with making the most product for the least amount of effort, okay? Bang for buck. So does a monopoly have to be efficient? From a productive point of view, no, because it can just simply charge more. Let's say, for example, a monopolist is Slack. Let's assume they're making something like this, right? And let's assume this is a monopoly. The monopoly is Slack in the sense that they don't care how much they spend for the container. Well, they spend a lot of money on it, so they charge a lot of money in order to pay for the container. They said, we don't care. As long as we're making a reasonable profit on this and our revenue is maximized, which is we can see, no matter what they paid for it, they'll just charge more, and seeing you're an only game in town, there's no reason for you to be productively efficient. Now, if this was a competitive firm, the competitive firm knows that there's 20 other companies selling similar products, and that it's going to get the lowest possible cost to make this product as inexpensively as possible in order to maximize their profits. That's not the case with a monopoly. A monopoly can just say, hey, this is how much it costs. We're going to tack on this much more, a cost plus type setup, and way to go. And we'll set our price accordingly, obviously, in order to maximize our revenues. But the price itself, we get to decide. And from an allocative point of view, allocative efficiency really means the right product at the right place at the right time. Okay? A monopolist doesn't have to worry about that. It's the only game in town. You've got to buy it from us. So, if you don't like the fact that we don't have it available for you right away, too bad. You'll buy it from us when we get around to it. So allocative efficiency is a real problem from a customer service point of view, I'll call it. Do you have the best interest of the consumer in mind if you're a monopolist? And you don't need to, because, again, they're the only ones selling the product. Monopolists, too, are often criticized for being unfair in terms of whoever owns the monopoly makes a ton of money, and whoever doesn't make any. So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook. He's a multi-billionaire because of the success of Facebook. He's laughing. Meanwhile, everybody else, even the people who work for Facebook, are making pittance relative to what he's making. But he owns the monopoly. He owns it, and nobody else can take it away from him. So he's going to continue to make all that money. So we've got this built-in, guaranteed, solidified inequity. Somebody makes a lot of money, the owner, and there's only one of them because there's only one firm, and everybody else doesn't make anything. So it creates this unequal, really unequal distribution of income and wealth within society. People who own stuff and people who don't. And monopolists, too, the other big criticisms they have is they get to use their market power to do things that we might not like. So price discrimination is one thing. What's to say that a monopolist can't say, well, I'm going to sell this product to you a little cheaper because I like you? Well, what are you going to do? Get upset? You got to still buy it from the monopolist, right? It's just there. So they can discriminate on the price of the quantity, on the basis of age, where you live, these sorts of things. And if you're not in that group who's benefiting, that's all you can do. You have no power over the monopolist. So a monopoly is certainly well-deservedly criticized for those things. And what government will do will look at each of those and say, what can we do in order to mitigate these problems? You know, make economic profits indefinitely. Let's tax them. Be productively and allocatively inefficient. This is particularly troublesome with regards to pollution, right? They could be polluting. Again, set laws or create some sort of government agency that oversees it. So, for example, like the Rate Services Board here in Newfoundland controls the rates of electricity for Newfoundland Power. You know that Newfoundland Power has to apply for a rate increase. Create an equal distribution of wealth. Let's tax the rich. We hear this in terms of political rhetoric all the time. We're going to go after the rich. But we know from our example of the parade of champions there, the idea of taxing the rich, there's so few super rich that, you know, there might be very easily to identify them, but still not going to solve all the problems because there's so few of them. You'd have to tax them so hugely that, you know, it wouldn't be a disincentive for them. And price discrimination, again, regulation would manage that sort of thing. So if we look at monopolies and we say, okay, well, they're bad, they're really bad. Well, let's just do a little bit of comparison before we say, well, what's good about it? Monopolies are both productively inefficient, allocatedly inefficiently. We talked about that. That is a problem because they can pollute or they can do stuff without worrying about doing it well. And a competitive environment, any company who does stuff that don't do it well will be driven out of the market. They won't be competitive with anyone else, and the market will take care of them by making them bankrupt. Basically, nobody will buy from them. The monopoly does not have that same degree of control on it by the market. Monopolies can charge higher prices and keep charging those higher prices because, again, if it is the only game in town, it can either set the price or set the quantity it produces. It has that ability. Private firms don't have that ability. So again, in the case of a private firm, the market will determine it. If the market wants the price to go down, you know, considering supply and demand, the market will go down. It doesn't have that same power with monopoly. And effectively, monopolies produce lower outputs than perfectly competitive firms. Why? Because they don't have to. They're going to look to maximize their revenue. That's it. Once they do that, they don't need to produce more units. And this is a real problem, for example, with the Pfizers of the world. We need Pfizer to produce lots and lots of drugs for the purposes of COVID. And reality is they are, but North America and these first world nations have a lot of power. The governments have a lot of power over Pfizer in terms of regulating them. What about countries in the third world? Do those governments have any power over Pfizer? Will Pfizer produce at the levels that are required in order to get the third world vaccinated? There's a lot of people questioning whether they will or won't. And finally today, I want to look at this issue of the defense of monopoly. So a monopoly, you know, on the surface, it looks like a very bad thing. We've seen that they're not very efficient. They make lots of money, and they can go on making lots of money for a long time. But in some cases, people are going to argue that a monopoly does some good. Why is it good? Because, first of all, it captures these large economies of scale. If your market in like Canada is relatively small, you got just a tens of million population. In order to make an airplane company a high barrier to entry business, an airplane company like Bombardier, in order to make them efficient, they need to not have any real competitors within Canada, and they need access to the world markets. So what the government will do is the government will say, okay, Bombardier, we're going to feed you some military contracts. We're going to give you some contracts for servicing. We're going to subsidize you in one way or another, your workers. We're going to provide training. So they are a monopoly from the point of view of an aircraft manufacturer in Canada. And the government has actually helped them grow through these incentives, because they need these huge economies of scale in order to compete with the Boeings and the Airbuses of the world. And that is, from a Canadian environment, a monopoly, from a world environment, they're in a very competitive environment. So the government has purposely said, let's focus on them. It's like picking your winners. And there's thousands of jobs that come out of that. They also engage in extensive research and development into new technology and new products. Now, again, this is where the patents come in. These large monopolies tend to be focused on certain types of business. Aerospace, drug manufacturing, high technology. So these are what we call future businesses. This is where lots of jobs are going to be in the future. These are brain jobs usually that require a highly skilled labor force. That's the type of thing that helps develop our country and makes our country competitive. It's not digging and hewers of wood and drawers of water that we've traditionally been, but we see, and government sees these things as being like the oil industry in Newfoundland, for example. We see this as a very high technology business. And with that high technology comes research and development in order to get the costs down or to be able to do things better. And these companies put a lot of money into this because, again, they might be monopolies from our local point of view, but from a broader perspective, they're probably in some sort of a competitive environment. Oil companies, for example, right? Very competitive environment internationally, not so competitive here in Canada. So if they can do all this research and development, we can help spur that along. That means our companies will benefit. It's like drilling for oil in really deep water off Newfoundland, okay? The Flemish Pass is really deep water. You can't set up a Hibernia type out there. It has to be a floating rig. And how do you drill in 10,000 feet of water? That type of technology is something that's unique to Newfoundland. They don't have that problem in Saudi Arabia. So how are we going to do that? Well, we want to allow these companies to be big so that they can invest lots and lots of money into research and development, which they've done here. For example, the university has done well at it, the college has done well at it, in order to find out about how to drill safely in deep water. And that will pay dividends in the long run when they actually drill in deep water and find oil out there. And that will, that's the theory, is that the payback will come back. The other thing that we find with these companies, as the oil company has shown us, is they pay relatively good wages and working conditions for their employees. People who work in the oil industry make good money. And that's the type of business. Now, you could argue that it's a monopoly. If ExxonMobil has all the keys to the closet here in Newfoundland, for example, it's a monopoly from a Newfoundland point of view, okay? But from a world point of view, it's not. And again, these good wages have built Southlands and all development. They built a lot of Clarenville. These sorts of things are very important to us. So again, we could argue that, okay, monopolies are bad in one sense, but there are benefits, and what we need to be able to do from a government or a public policy point of view is to say, let's regulate the monopoly to manage it, but let's take the advantages of it too and see what we can do there in order to grow it further along. So, if we wanted to say, well, what's the big difference between the monopoly and a perfect competition? Well, first of all, monopolies are not very efficient, whereas perfectly competitive firms are forced to be efficient. We also learned that monopolies can charge much higher prices than perfectly competitive firms because the perfectly competitive firm has this idea that someone else will undercut them. And monopolies produce lower outputs than perfectly competitive firms. They don't need to produce as much in order to make maximum profit. So their outputs are really below the economic capacity of the mill or the shop or the operation. So you're not getting good use of your material. We also looked at, well, what's the good thing about monopoly? What kind of positive things can we say about monopolies? Well, first of all, they get big. And because they get big, they tend to be more efficient. In other words, if you could have one large company doing one good job, that would do a much better job than 6 little tiny companies that are not as well resourced. So it's advantageous to be bigger. Bigness allows to get these economies of scale and scope and these sorts of things. They engage in extensive research and development. Well, because they're the only game in town, they have lots of money to put into research and development, which might not be the case with purely competitive firms seeing they're so busy competing. And finally, they offer relatively good wages and working conditions for employees. Seeing they're not as stressed in terms of living in and working in a competitive environment, they can afford usually to pay their wages higher. The final issue that is talked about in this section is, well, okay, considering that monopolists exist and considering they come with some problems, what can we do to manage them? And this is where government comes in. Well, if monopolists can go on making profits forever, one thing that government can do is certainly tax the monopolists. They could either take a lump sum tax on their assets or something, or a per unit cost. So, for example, for every ton of product they make, we charge them some sort of a tax. So, if we were to think about a lump sum payment, it has no connection with price and quantity. It's really irrelevant. Whereas the per unit is certainly tied to units sold. And if you sell a lot of units, you make a lot of money. If you don't sell a lot of units, you're not making a lot of money. We could also regulate a monopoly to force them to charge a certain price, and that price may not be an efficient price operating level. In other words, they're not necessarily maximizing your profit. So government like this because it allows government to bring the prices down and to make it a social optimum pricing. In other words, most people can afford it. So without destroying the monopoly still makes some money, but not as much as it could make in an unregulated environment. And the final option that government have, and this is one that a lot of our governments have done, is they nationalize it. What that means is if you're a monopoly out there and you're not treating your customers to the best of what everyone thinks they should be treated, government can come in and say, look, okay, enough of this. We're going to buy this from you. And then we're going to make it a crown corporation or owned by the crown. And that way we can adjust our prices that are socially optimum. In other words, fair to most people. So that last option is really something a lot of governments do. Let's buy out the monopolists, and that way we have control over what they charge. And there's been a lot of debate lately that says, Facebook should be bought by the government. And once it's bought by the government, then government can bring in some controls for Facebook that don't exist right now. So that, in summary, is that chapter. And those are the issues that we're looking at. As I say, we're not so much focused on the monetary or the mathematical components to this. We have to be able to relate to the good, the bad, and the ugly of monopolists and what government can do to manage them.